Your mother made me promise. Take this key. But whatever you do, don't let your brother see it.
That warning uncovered our family's darkest secret.
The girl in black waited until my mother's coffin had been lowered into the ground. Then she pressed a small brass key into my hand and whispered, "Your mother said you could have this only after she was gone. She also said your brother must never see it." Hello, my name is Daniel Harper. I was 51 years old when my mother died, and until the day of her funeral, I believed I knew every important secret in our family. I was wrong. My mother, Evelyn, was 73. She lived alone in the same quiet house in Ohio where my brother and I had grown up. After my father died, I asked her many times to move closer to me in Columbus, but she always refused. "This house remembers me," she would say. "I'm not ready to become a guest in somebody else's life." My older brother, Richard, lived only 15 minutes away from her. He was a successful real estate developer, always perfectly dressed and always talking as if every conversation were a business meeting. He told everyone that he looked after Mom. He took her to medical appointments, handled her bills, and checked the house whenever something broke. At least, that was what I believed. About 6 months before Mom died, I started noticing a strange visitor during our Saturday video calls. She looked about 19 or 20. Her hair was dyed black with a purple streak. She wore dark lipstick, a leather jacket, heavy boots, and several silver rings. Sometimes I saw her pass behind Mom carrying tea. Other times I heard them laughing together in the kitchen. The first time I asked about her, Mom smiled in a way I did not understand. "That's Raven," she said. "She's helping me with a little project." "What project?" Then Mom changed the subject. I assumed Raven was a neighbor's daughter. Richard did not see it that way. He called me one evening and said the girl was probably trying to steal from Mom. "She appears every Saturday and stays for hours," he said. "She has no family connection to us. Mom is vulnerable." I asked if anything had gone missing. "Not yet," he replied. "But people like that wait until they earn your trust." I should have challenged him. Instead, I let his certainty influence me. The next Saturday, I drove to Mom's house without warning. Raven opened the door. In person, she looked less frightening than the image Richard had created. She had tired eyes and chipped black nail polish. Around her neck was a silver locket shaped like a bird. "You must be Daniel," she said. I asked how she knew my name. "Your mom talks about you." Behind her, Mom called from the living room. "Stop questioning my guest on the porch and come inside." A raven had been helping Mom scan old photographs onto a laptop. There were boxes of family albums on the table, but I noticed something strange. Most of the pictures showed Mom before her marriage. A few were from the early years with Dad. None included Richard or me. When Raven stepped into the kitchen, I asked Mom why she trusted her. Mom's expression changed. "Because she listened when nobody else would." That answer bothered me. I reminded her that Richard and I were always available. "Available is not the same as listening," she said softly. Before I could ask what she meant, Richard arrived. He walked in without knocking and stopped when he saw Raven. His face became pale for one brief second. Then anger covered it. "Why is she here again?" he demanded. Raven stood very still. Mom rose from her chair. She was small and weak by then, but her voice was firm. "Because I invited her." Richard pointed toward the door. "She is using you." "No," Mom said. "You are afraid of her." The room went silent. Richard laughed, but the sound was forced. He said Mom was confused because of her medication. Then he told me privately that we needed to discuss power of attorney before she made a serious mistake. That was the first moment I wondered whether the danger in Mom's house was not the strange girl in black, but my own brother. 2 weeks later, Mom fell in her kitchen. Raven found her and called an ambulance. At the hospital, the doctor told us that Mom's heart was failing. She might have months, or she might have days. Richard immediately began asking about her will. I was ashamed that I noticed, but I noticed. Mom came home under hospice care. During my last private conversation with her, she squeezed my fingers and said, "Daniel, I made mistakes because I was scared. When the truth comes, do not protect the person who caused the pain." I asked what truth she meant. She looked toward the hallway, where Richard was speaking on the phone. "Trust the girl who looks like darkness," Mom whispered. "She brought me the light." Mom died 3 days later. At the funeral, Richard gave a polished speech about sacrifice, family, and devotion. People shook his hand and told him he had been a wonderful son. Raven stood alone beneath a maple tree, dressed completely in black. Several relatives stared at her. One aunt asked me whether she had come to cause trouble. After everyone left the cemetery, Raven approached me and gave me the key. It was attached to a faded paper tag. Written on it were 3 numbers, 2 and a fortune. "What does it open?" I asked. "A locker at the old Union Station," she said. "Your mom rented it under her maiden name. She made me promise I would give you the key after the funeral. Why me? Raven looked toward Richard, who was standing beside his black car across the road. Because he thinks he already won. Before I could ask another question, she walked away. The old station had been converted into a bus terminal and storage center. Locker 214 stood at the end of a narrow corridor beneath a flickering light. I inserted the key with shaking hands. Inside was a metal cash box, a thick envelope, and a small digital recorder. The envelope had my name on it. I pressed play on the recorder. My mother's voice filled the empty corridor. Daniel, if you are hearing this, I am gone. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. Richard has been stealing from me for almost 4 years. I nearly dropped the recorder. Mom explained that Richard had offered to manage her finances after Dad died. At first, he paid the bills and organized everything. Later, he persuaded her to sign documents she did not understand. He told her they were forms to reduce taxes and protect the house. They were not. He had opened a home equity line of credit in her name. He had transferred money from her retirement account into companies he controlled. He had even prepared paperwork that would give him ownership of her house immediately after her death. Mom discovered the truth when the bank sent a late payment notice Richard failed to intercept. She confronted him. He told her the investments would recover and warned that exposing him would destroy the family. Then her voice broke. He said no one would believe an old woman whose memory was failing. I sat on the cold floor and stared at the cash box. Inside it were bank statements, copies of checks, property documents, and printed emails. There was also a photograph of Raven as a smiling little girl beside a woman I did not recognize. On the back, Mom had written Leela and her daughter, Rebecca, 2011. Raven's real name was Rebecca. At the bottom of the box was another letter. Mom explained that Rebecca's mother, Leela, had worked as a bookkeeper for Richard. 2 years earlier, Leela discovered that he was moving money through false renovation invoices. When she questioned him, Richard accused her of theft and fired her. He threatened to ruin her reputation if she spoke publicly. Leela tried to fight him, but she became ill. She died before she could prove what had happened. Rebecca found her mother's backup drive while clearing out their apartment. The records connected Richard's business fraud to the money missing from Mom's accounts. Rebecca contacted Mom, expecting anger or denial. Instead, Mom invited her inside. Every Saturday, they built the case together. The photographs on the table had not been a family project. Raven had been scanning documents and matching dates. Mom had hidden the evidence behind innocent images because Richard sometimes checked her laptop. The final recording ended with a warning. Do not confront him alone. There is one more thing in the blue folder. Read it before you decide what kind of man your brother has become. The blue folder contained a copy of a life insurance policy worth $800,000. Richard was the sole beneficiary. Stapled behind it was a pharmacy report showing repeated early refills for Mom's heart medication. According to the report, someone using Richard's authorization had collected her pills, but Mom had often complained that pills were missing. My grief changed into fear. I called Raven from the station parking lot. She answered immediately. Did Richard hurt her? I asked. I don't know, she said. Your mom didn't know either. But she became sick much faster after she confronted him. A Raven told me that Mom had asked her to install a small camera in the kitchen. For 3 weeks, it recorded nothing unusual. Then, one Saturday, Richard entered while Mom was asleep. He opened the medicine cabinet, removed 2 bottles, and replaced them with others. Where is that video? I asked. Seth. I drove straight to the police station. But Raven stopped me before I entered. If you hand them everything now, Richard will claim your mother was confused and I manipulated her, she said. He already started telling people that story. She was right. That evening, Richard called and asked whether Raven had given me anything. His voice sounded casual, but he repeated the question 3 times. I lied and said she had only given me one of Mom's old necklaces. He was silent for a moment. That girl is unstable, he finally said. Do not let her pull you into some fantasy. The next morning, I discovered that Mom's house had been searched. Drawers were open. Papers covered the floor. Nothing valuable appeared to be missing. Richard arrived 10 minutes after I called him. Too quickly. He blamed Raven and insisted we call the police. While pretending to help, he kept asking whether Mom had rented a storage unit. I watched him move through the house with perfect concern on his face, and I realized he was performing for me. So I performed too. I told him I was tired, confused, and ready to let him manage the estate. Relief flashed in his eyes. That's sensible, he said. You were never good with this kind of pressure. That sentence brought back memories I had ignored for years. Richard had always decided who was smart, who was weak, and whose version of events mattered. He had not suddenly become cruel. He had simply become rich enough to hide it. Raven and I spent the next week organizing the evidence. We met with an attorney named Susan Keller, who specialized in elder financial abuse. Susan confirmed that several of Richard's documents appeared fraudulent. Mom's signature had been copied, and one form had supposedly been notarized on a day Mom was in the hospital. Susan contacted a detective and a forensic accountant. This time, we did not give Richard any warning. And then the situation became even darker. The laboratory tested the pills Raven had saved from Mom's cabinet. The bottles were labeled as heart medication, but several capsules contained a much weaker dose. They were not immediately poisonous. Instead, they could have allowed Mom's condition to worsen while making her death appear natural. The detective would not call it murder without more proof, but he called it evidence of deliberate interference. I felt sick. I kept remembering Richard at the hospital, asking about the will while our mother struggled to breathe. Still, the police needed to know whether he understood what he had done. Susan proposed that I meet him while wearing a recording device. Ohio law allowed a conversation to be recorded when one participant consented. I agreed. We met at Mom's house on a rainy Thursday night. I placed the empty cash box on the kitchen table. Richard stared at it and stopped pretending. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "Locker 214. His face hardened. I told him I had destroyed the documents because I did not want a scandal. Then I said I needed to understand why he had changed Mom's medication. He paced around the kitchen. At first he denied everything. Then I mentioned the camera. He froze. "You don't understand what was happening," he said. "Her heart was already failing. So you decided to help it fail faster. I decided to stop her from destroying everything I built." There it was. Not a full confession, but close. Richard said he had borrowed Mom's money to save a development project. When the project failed, he borrowed more to cover the first loss. Leela discovered the false invoices, and Mom later found the bank records. Both women, he said, had threatened to ruin him over money he planned to repay. "And the insurance?" I asked. "That was always supposed to fix it." The coldness of those words still follows me. I asked what was inside the replacement capsules. Richard stepped close and lowered his voice. "Nothing that killed her. I only reduced the dose. She was going to die anyway." The kitchen door opened. 2 detectives entered with Susan behind them. Raven stood on the porch, rain shining on her black hair. Richard looked at me as if I had betrayed him. Maybe in his mind, I had. He believed family loyalty meant protecting him from consequences. Mom had taught me something different in her final days. Loyalty without truth is only another name for fear. Richard was arrested that night. The investigation uncovered more than $2 million in fraudulent transfers involving Mom, Leela, and 3 elderly clients of his development company. The medical evidence led to additional charges related to tampering with Mom's medication and criminal neglect. He tried to blame an employee. He tried to blame Raven. Finally, he tried to blame me. But Mom had prepared for every lie. Months before her death, she had changed her will with an independent attorney. The house was to be sold. Part of the money would repay the victims Richard had cheated. Another part would create a scholarship in Leela's name for young people studying accounting and elder advocacy. Richard received $1. Attached to that dollar was a handwritten note from Mom's. "This is the only money of mine you may keep without stealing it." That was her revenge. Quiet, legal, and impossible for him to twist. Richard eventually accepted a plea agreement that sent him to prison for many years. No sentence could bring Mom or Leela back, but the truth cleared Leela's name and protected other families from becoming Richard's next victims. As for Raven, she was not a criminal, a manipulator, or a frightening stranger. She was a grieving daughter who had carried evidence no adult wanted to see. Under the dark makeup and metal jewelry was someone braver than I had ever been. She used part of the scholarship fund to attend college. She chose forensic accounting. I kept Mom's house until the case ended. On the last Saturday before it was sold, Raven and I sat in the kitchen drinking tea from Mom's favorite blue cups. The room was almost empty. Afternoon light fell across the table, where they had once worked in secret. Raven removed the silver bird locket from her neck and opened it. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, her mother on one side and mine on the other. "Your mom gave me a family when I had none left," she said. I told her the truth. "You gave my mother courage when her own sons failed her." She reached into her pocket and placed the brass key on the table. For months, I had thought that key opened a locker. In reality, it opened the part of my mother's life that fear had kept closed. It showed me her guilt, her strength, and the final plan she created when everyone underestimated her. I still think about the first time I saw Raven at Mom's door. I judged her by her clothes. Richard wore expensive suits, spoke politely, and smiled in family photographs. Raven wore black and looked like trouble. Only one of them came to save my mother. My mother did not live long enough to see Richard face justice, but she made certain justice knew exactly where to find him. And the key she left behind did more than unlock a box. It unlocked the truth, cleared an innocent woman's name, and reminded me that darkness is not always found in the person wearing black.